We're on a 50-year cycle. That's the way I've estimated it. History repeats itself in cycles. Now, what I'm saying to you is that in teaching, my thing is that teach a student how to learn and to seek. Once they learn the greatness of past civilizations, they say, wait a minute, I'm the member of the greatest civilization that's ever existed on the earth. So when these people in today's age, they're going to discover all of a sudden, I see a work of art and it looks like me, celebrates my people. It over generations is ingrained and it's repeated, okay? The information is out there, especially in today's age.
Columbia Heights neighbor Alton UZIKEE Nelson is a different kind of artist. He calls his work African-American stylized art.
You know what realistic art is, like you make a sculpture exactly look like you. Abstract art would be art that you couldn't tell what it really looked like. Whereas mine is kind of like a combination of both.
When Alton finishes this piece, he'll be adding to a collection that is getting attention and praise throughout all of Columbia Heights. The entire process can take 3 months or 3 years, but his hard work, long hours, and determination are about a lot more than the finished product.
A lot of blacks, when I was growing up in Mississippi, didn't feel very good about their African heritage. They were more concerned about whatever, but they weren't concerned with it. So that's why I want them to feel good about their African heritage.
There are even 3 pieces just outside of his home on Belmont Street and a 17-foot monument-like sculpture on 16th Street. All of this from a man who never took a single art class.
(1968) is as clear in my mind as we're here today. I was sitting at Howard University as a young 19-year-old student in my classroom, Mr. Wells' classroom. And through the black grapevine, all of a sudden this message came out. It was on the it was on the radio. And somebody said, Martin Luther King's been shot. They said it was shot, and then they said he's been killed. And so it was like as if we were in a trance. And we immediately went into the streets. So as we walked towards 14th Street, we started smelling smoke. And then you actually started to see fires.
When Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, all hell broke loose, and the teeming masses could not be contained.
We all know that the roots of injustice run deep, but violence cannot redress a solitary wrong.
Throughout the evening and into the following 2 days and nights, a shock wave of looting and arson would sweep through a number of cities and towns from coast to coast, including Washington, D.C.
People were scrambling because the rebellions all over the country were really more than what anybody knew how to deal with. You had these rebellions, which were mistakenly called race riots. They were rebellions by black people, mostly fed up with police brutality and other kinds of injustices. And so this spread all over the country, people trying to do things to calm the restive spirit that was bubbling all over black America.
Some of us saw the destruction of white supremacy being burned out. That's the way some of us looked at it.
The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him. Men who are white, men who are black, must and will now join together as never in the past.
The kind of bourgeois in-betweens who were angry and frustrated and bitter themselves, and D.C. had to do something.
When Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, that started to change in the dynamics of the District of Columbia.
I mean, folks started looking for black PhDs everywhere, and really in all fields that blacks had been sort of locked out that were academically oriented.
Before '68, all the people that ran the district, they was appointed by the president. So at that time, Lyndon Johnson appointed a guy named Walter Washington, the mayor of the city. But when they had the riots, they couldn't go out and talk to the people at all. So they went out and got these DJs on the black radio station, Petey Green, different other people. And then they went and got people like James Brown to talk to them to stop burning the city.
And in 1968, the white flight was just enormous. White people felt that they had no place left in the city and left. What D.C. was known as was the Chocolate City. D.C. was like a majority black town.
It was a city right after the riots that had poverty that should not have existed.
And so all of a sudden, D.C. required special attention.
President Johnson hired Dr. Cleveland Denard to come to Washington to get all these black architects and engineers involved in the planning of Washington Tech. And soon as Congress authorized it, they started building the next day.
The Washington Technical Institute was created in 1968, and its main objective was employment.
It was put into place to address the specific demands and needs of education of the young people here in the District of Columbia.
UZIKEE Nelson is a partner of mine from WTI. We met as soon as he arrived on campus, and I observed his work from the beginning. And I just thought of him more of an artist than as a professor. And we sort of got together because it seemed like we were both somewhat strange to some other people. I'm just learning now that we both were run out of the cities that we were living in.
Peoria, Illinois was an industrial town. It was a union town, but it was also a Republican town. Peoria is so Republican that when Nixon was at the low point of his political career, he came to Peoria. Caterpillar was the main employer, had Harlem Walker, the distillery, and the meatpacking district, but it was basically a union town with a lot of labor jobs that were nice middle-class paying jobs where you could feed your family and live the American dream.
90% of the wealth in Peoria came from Caterpillar. Caterpillar ruled the town lock, stock, and barrel. Caterpillar is a company that made tractors that moved dirt for highways, bridges, and all this kind of stuff. And they only had blacks in Caterpillar working in foundries or assembly lines. I was born in Tupelo, Mississippi in 1938, the son of Sarita and Dr. John Nelson. My father was a traveling dentist in Tupelo. That's how we survived the Depression. Then he built an office. My father owned 2 apartment buildings in Tupelo, 4-unit apartment buildings, okay? And all the places he lived in Mississippi, he'd end up buying some houses, somewhere, some kind of way. My mother wanted us to know about black history. The reason is we had these books in our house about black history, 100 things that black people did, and things like that, because she wanted us to know about it. I was in Tupelo Mississippi, when the Brown decision came down in 1954. I was in 9th grade when the Brown decision happened, around that time in May. So my brother came back from finishing college in Peoria from Bradley University, and he took the GI induction to the Army, okay? And in the meantime, while he took it, he was smiling because he called him Smiling when he was growing up, because he smiled a lot. And so the woman at the induction place thought he was smiling at her during the induction. So she called the police and had him arrested, because smiling at her, I guess flirting with her. He was kind of frightened after that, so he never came back to Tupelo when it came to go into the service. And the FBI came to our house looking for my brother. When he was supposed to come up this date, he was supposed to show up, the FBI showed up, and why are you not there? So that I remember in Tupelo. They also had Black History Month in school. We were studying Black History Month from Carter G. Woodson. Books that he had and other books my mother had. Tupelo had a wonderful educational background for us. Basically, most of all the people that could graduate from high school in Tupelo was expected to go to college. That was expected of us to go to college. They said you had to take all academic courses. And teachers are the most important thing to put your outlook on the life, telling you could do this or do that, trying to inspire us to do something with our life. So we just wasn't expected to go to work in a factory and be happy the rest of our life. And then when it came to Peoria, we only had white teachers.
At Peoria High School, everyone gets a chance to help play the game. There are a wide variety of math courses that can be taken to prepare you for any type of future training or work.
In 1955, I went to Peoria Central High School, and I signed up for classes, and I signed up for trigonometry, because my best subjects was like Algebra 1 and 2, I got all the A's. So less than a week after I was there, they told me they were removing me from trigonometry and put me in woodshop, because I guess that was the standard practice in Peoria. You're not going to use no trigonometry for anything. That's what happened. They control your destiny by what classes they allow you to take.
Tupelo was a place where you were taught, everyone went to college. 99% of the class went to college. In Peoria, it was a total different expectation of the person.
Homeownership is the basis of a happy, contented family life. And now, through the use of a National Housing Act insured mortgage, is brought within the reach of all citizens on a monthly payment plan no greater than rent.
My father was a kind of militant, in the sense that they didn't allow him to borrow money to buy his first house. They allowed him money to buy a Lincoln, but they wouldn't allow him to buy houses in Peoria. You could rent, but you couldn't buy. So it was kind of unusual. I don't know how that came about. The banks in town didn't allow no blacks to buy nothing. You had to go some other place to get the money. So my father had to go out of town to a little town, an all-white town called Pekin, Illinois. It was what they call a sundown town. And they financed his first house, apartment building in Peoria.
My father wanted us to be the best we could be in whatever we pursued. So he wanted us to go to school, and we did. All of us went to college. My sister Sarita went to Bradley and graduated. My sister Winona also went to Bradley and graduated. My brother John went to Bradley and graduated. He couldn't get a job though.
They didn't allow us to work in the office or anything like that in Peoria. So my brother started this Standard Oil gas station. We had 3 or 4 pumps, but my job was to run the gas station after high school, and that's what I did. He had also started a cab business because blacks had to have their own cab business because the white people wouldn't pick them up too much. So I did that, and eventually I decided I was going to college. And I thought I was going to Bradley, and I went up and took the test, and they said, well, no, you can't get in here because we don't think you can make it. And that's when I started down Southern Illinois in 1960. And eventually I transferred from general studies to technology and engineering. And there was a difference between technology and engineering. Engineering basically told you theoretically how to do stuff, but never gave you no practical experience of running any of these machines or anything.
After I graduated from high school, my father wanted me to go to Bradley the way my older sisters and brother had gone. And I said no, I wanted to go to Southern Illinois because my brother was there and I followed his footsteps. He was my mentor in college.
So I graduated. Then I had a chance to go to work for McDonnell Douglas, which is now Boeing Aircraft in St. Louis in 1965 through 67. So I worked for them a while. And so while I was at McDonald's, they had these numerical control milling machines. I took a course from them because I wanted to find out about numerical control because they didn't have nothing like that at Southern Illinois. They had these machines that would make parts by running the machine. They didn't need a man. So I worked for them a while, about 2 years, and then I had a chance to go to work for Caterpillar. I was in management for Caterpillar. I went through all their programs like scheduling, training, teaching their new hires how to read blueprints and everything. So I did all of this thing. I was teaching in the class. And I also went out in the shop and did different things, made things for them.
He was doing this art stuff, you know, like he starts carving, he's carving things. He carves an African figurehead face and puts it in a leather cord, gives it to me to wear. He always wanted to make sure that you stay on point, that you know your heritage.
My younger brother, he was about at least 15 years or more younger than I am. My father had Austin by his second wife. And his second wife was named Virgie. And she was a wonderful woman. And she made my first dashiki when I was in Peoria.
Around that time, NAACP was huge in Peoria. You had John Gwynn, who was our king.
Now, John Gwynn was the head of the state NAACP. He was the guy that was behind desegregating everything in Peoria that was humanly possible. But anyhow, they had a talk program on the radio, and I went on the radio with John Gwynn. So I just wanted talking to him. I told him I'd do something for him. And I know I can make stuff because I made stuff my whole life. And I learned a lot of stuff from watching people at Caterpillar. So I did this 12-foot tall piece and put it up in the neighborhood where I was living for the NAACP.
It was this big steel thing, you know. I was used to sculptures like the ones they have in the courthouse, you know, the Civil War and that kind of thing. People with guns and this, that, and the other. And suddenly there's this very large black steel monolith.
And then they gave me an award for putting it up. And that's when I started to become an artist.
My father and UZIKEE would have their share of conflicts. And I'm not sure, I was a kid. I don't know what the arguments were about.
My father was a dentist that worked on people from Caterpillar all the time. And my father told me, son, they're putting you on these weird shifts, so they must be trying to get rid of you. Don't spend your money. Shortly after that, they told me, we gotta let you go. I don't know what I did, but I know they let me go. They gave me 2 weeks' notice. My father told me, son, I told you they were gonna do it. Looking back on all that, I thought that was my lucky break. They got me out of Peoria, looking at a bigger world. Peoria was a very lonesome town for me. There wasn't too much for me to do after work. There was only one cultural place in the whole town, and that was the Carver Center, George Washington Carver Center, where Richard Pryor got his start in being an actor. And that's the only place that they allowed for blacks to go, was the Carver Center. And finally, I left town. In 1971, I had just finished an internship in St. Louis with the Ford Foundation at Florescentville Junior College. Then finally, I got this phone call from Denard. He told me he wanted me to come to Washington. We need you bad, because most of the other people that he had hired, they were academic type, but they didn't know how to run the machines in the machine shop, and also the welding and other things. They weren't hands-on person, but I had got all this hands-on experience for Caterpillar, and I came on to Washington Tech. Dr. Cleveland Denard was a guy that could talk, and people, he didn't talk above a whisper almost, but he talked and everybody listened to him.
He developed his educational objectives and delivered them, as I would say, within a conceptual framework that today we look at as an Excel spreadsheet. UZIKEE Nelson showed young people how they could take a piece of iron, for example, and do many things with it.
When I came to Washington, I taught the classes they wanted me to teach. I even had a shop to work in. People didn't know it at the time. They thought I was a real artist, which I was, because I made stuff out of steel. Within 6 months I came to Washington, I had an art show.
The Washington Technical Institute has been double-teamed by a sculptor and an artist. They have teamed up together to form a painting sculpture exhibit that will run through March 8th. Alan UZIKEE Nelson is an industrial engineering instructor here, and you have quite a piece of work behind you. Al, what kind of sculpture work is this?
It's a modern technology sculpture with an African design to it, in that I use modern technology and African design.
This is sort of a new type of art, isn't it? There are more people doing it now.
Well, I would kind of say so. I think I'm the first to start using stained glass with my work, but I don't know, because people are using different type of design, but I think I'm kind of the first.
One other thing I liked about Denard was what I call an Afrocentric person. I got in the office building right across from the school. He put 2 or 3 of my sculptures in his office. People worked their butt off to try to do something positive for Denard and themselves. So there was no dissension at all going on that I knew of at Washington Tech. At that time, Nixon needed to give a speech about vocational stuff. He couldn't go to Georgetown or George Washington because the students at these other colleges and everything were just raising hell. They were protesting the war in Vietnam because they didn't want to go and fight in this war. By that time, they decided the war was bad for them. The students, they didn't want it. They were burning their draft cards and everything. So Nixon got in contact with Denard and said, could I have a speech? I said, I'll get you to have a speech up here. So after Nixon had his speech, he talked to Denard and asked Denard, what do you want for your school? And Denard told him, well, he needed some land to build his school. And across Van Ness on the northeast side was a lot of vacant land that the federal government had abandoned.
Dr. Denard wanted a land grant status, and we had to manage and operate the institute at the same time that we were working on creating a university. And Dr. Denard was doing that mostly in his dealings with congressmen.
Denard built everything that you know of as UDC was started as Washington Tech.
And he brought the UDC image together in his mind and on paper.
My old dean, I had a dean named Dean Brock. He asked me would I make a falcon bird. So I made the falcon and put the design on it. So I made the mace for the school. They used it about 4 or 5 years until they merged the school into UDC.
UZIKEE lives in an area of Washington which is basically the cultural element of the African American experience in D.C. And that is the largest African American historic district in the whole country.
My brother thought about what he could afford, and he found a house that he really liked on Belmont Street. And it had a beautiful view of the city. And he fixed it up. He redid all the walls, and the floors, and what have you.
When I first moved around here, I worked every day because I had to get my house in shape enough to live in. And I was looking for a wife who could be able to handle it. A lot of women couldn't handle Belmont Street.
Janua had her own thing about arts, and she's into fabrics and clothing, and she's a designer.
I met UZIKEE in 1977. He was sharing a birthday with a friend of mine, and they had a birthday party together. And I met UZIKEE, and we hit it off.
I met her when she was in the art school. Before I started going out with her, she went to Nigeria to a thing they call Festac. It went on about a month or so during Jimmy Carter's time. He took people over to West Africa, and she was selected to go. And when I got married to her, I told her she liked to make her own fashions, her clothes. So I like that. If we married in this house, right here.
It's been a wonderful journey being married to a fellow artist. We share a lot of the same interests in the arts. Both of us were social, cultural activists through the arts before we joined forces together.
All my art that I have in here is original art from Africa. Now, most of the art in America is made for consumption, whereas this is used to transmit a culture. Their art, they do it kind of similar, but it's to transmit their culture. They can tell who did this by the design. If you notice up here, it's different. This is a butterfly mask. So I have different kinds of masks. And with the exception of one piece in here, all the pieces that you see are African art, with the exception of this piece right here. My wife made this from a collection of broken pieces of African art that she collected and found and put together with some mirrors and some glass. The rest of them are different masks from different countries in Africa, because we've been all over West Africa pretty much. So we've been a lot of places. We've been to Cuba. We have stuff from Cuba and different places that we've gone.
He is the floor, the wind beneath the wings of Janua, so that she's able to just create and explode and just go into all of her dimensions, because she has his support and unwavering support, and without critique, without edit. Why you do that? No, just go on and do what you do, because I got you. We got this. Here in D.C., it's really a unique cultural cauldron. I mean, you got Duke Ellington, Eckstein, all these legends who came out of here in music and the arts. The Blackbirds, doing it in the park, Rock Creek Park. Howard University, with its reputation, is nicknamed the Mecca. So many brilliant minds and people who came out of this place. So many contributions came from people here in D.C. And then you have the local cultural arts community, when I look at a couple of the pillars in this community, is UZIKEE and Janua Moja. They are really so important. They live in a showcase.
Yeah, I met Janua Moja and UZIKEE Nelson, and it feels like I've known them forever, like for many lifetimes actually. And I really do consider them my family, and I am very grateful to be part of really an artist community in Washington, D.C. that really supports and loves each other. And Janua and UZIKEE are very central to that.
But your work is representing life, representing people, but it's represented in a higher form than the physical, and it's broadly considered abstract. I met UZIKEE maybe 20, 30 years ago, I'll put it that way. I was working with his wife. She was doing productions and so forth, and so he says, oh, how long y'all be here? Y'all finished the meeting? I said, yeah, we finished in a minute. He said, I want to show you something. So I saw his architectural design. I found out about his mechanical credentials, you know, in terms of his university work and so forth. That's all good, but then I'm seeing this magnificent art. And I'm saying, well, wow, this is another side to this person that I just shook hands with.
Most of all my artwork has some reference to the museum African art collection before I started my own collection. So I would go down to the Museum of African Art. Before that, I only looked at African art in books. So I would go down to and look at African art. And I was seeing the real thing rather than just the stuff in the books.
My brother and I both like art, and I'm more of an appreciator of art. He's a creator of art, but he has a view of the world that's different.
UZIKEE always wanted to bring attention to the heroes and people in the community that we should be paying attention to. Have people understand and realize it and make it an important part in their life.
He likes to make art that has a statement about people and about the world he grew up in and our family.
The art that I make, I use all the engineering processes I picked up at Southern Illinois to be able to make this stuff. How to make it strong enough to stand up in the wind. You just can't make it and don't take no consideration how strong it is. Different metals swell or contract according to what kind of material it is. Wood, steel, concrete, everything expands at a different rate and shrinks at a different rate. None of them span together. So that's why you have to take into consideration expansion and contraction when you're putting different metals together. Engineering gave me the big thing to be able to do stuff, make stuff. And the glass gave me the most wonderful thing I can ever think of. This is my very first sculpture that I made with steel and stained glass in 1972, right after I came to Washington. Stained glass added the best flavor with my art I ever could think of. Because what I found out, the light from the sun, the reflection from the light had a hell of an effect on my artwork. It changes with the time of the day, the time of the year, and reflection of the sun.
When I look at UZIKEE, I see a person who has mastered iron. And not only has he mastered iron, but he has mastered iron in a way that really does traverse the past, the present, and the future.
When he's welding his sculpture and doing his artwork, it's a beautiful energy lifted throughout the house and throughout the day during those kind of times. We kind of connect and reinforce the energy through each other.
And then he's a visionary, you know, what we used to call, or some people still call him Afro-futurists, raising the consciousness of the arts and the importance of artists and such. He's still being supportive in all the ways that he's able to.
Everybody is different in the family, and so I was the unusual one. Because I ended up doing sculpture.
Yes.
I didn't even think about it.
Right.
I never even thought about it. That's the craziest thing.
Yeah.
I did a piece and that kind of like made me famous.
I have always looked at Zeke from the perspective of an artist, an individual, a brother who understands and lives the essence of our cultural identity and cultural life.
I started to get involved with Afrocentricity in Carbondale, Illinois. They called me Stretch. That's what they called me in Carbondale. I didn't have a middle name, so I decided I was going to give myself a middle name with a little more African flavor to it. So it was a guy named Eziwe, who was the first president of Nigeria. So I decided, well, why don't I give myself a middle name, my artist name? So I took this name, UZIKEE. But after I left Carbondale, nobody called me Stretch. All my friends called me UZIKEE because I started doing this artwork.
Malcolm X Park is at a unique location, and it's a unique, beautiful, beautiful landscape and a beautiful surrounding.
Malcolm X Park is an unofficial name for the Meridian Hill Park. Now, the Meridian Hill Park was built in the 20s by this woman, Henderson. She owned a lot of property around the neighborhood and had a big castle over there. It's a beautiful park. It's the only waterfall in the city. Meridian Hill Park is located from 16th Street to 15th Street, Euclid, and Florida Avenue. That is the boundaries for Meridian Hill Park.
The location is on 16th Street is the 78th meridian that circle the globe and go through the North Pole and South Pole. That's why you have a bunch of embassies located there. All of the Shriners, the Masons, they have 3 or 4 Masonic temples along 16th Street because it's for some reason on a meridian, and these guys, I mean, that's part of their cosmology to be, you know, in line with the stars and all that. So you got the Scottish Rites, you got the Masonics, you got all these temples, and so the anchor of the Meridian Hill, it's on a hill, it's on the meridian. It was strong in the 70s, it was strong in the 80s, and it still is a meeting place, a gathering place, but it's always been kept under tight control by the National Park Service.
In the 1920s, when the park was built, they didn't allow blacks to come on the other side of 13th Street. They had a dividing line, restricted covenants. They decided where blacks could live and where they could go. So you couldn't go to the park because that was restricted for you not to go there. But you could go to the library. Now you can go to the library on 16th Street, but you couldn't go no other place. You couldn't go to the parks, no, you couldn't go to that park. Malcolm X Park was dangerous when I came around here in 1974. A few people have been killed over there, so I didn't go over there at night at all. But I did go over there when they had African Liberation Day.
Black people gathered in Malcolm X Park from all over the United States. Buses arrived from the South, North, and Midwest.
Join us as we bring you continuing coverage of the Liberation Day March and for live coverage of the rally, right here on your community radio, WHUR.
They was talking about African liberation, getting rid of colonialism in Africa. They right in the park. The federal government allowed them to have African liberation there, and then they eventually went downtown on the mall.
Then there will be very little for any of us to enjoy when we talk about the liberation of all the other people. I have no message other than to say that this is a very beautiful thing, and it shows that we do love each other, and that the basis for our struggle is love.
Because I have these pieces, like this piece over here. Guess what I could do? I could take $1 and take it over there and set it up during African Liberation Day, because that's what it was. So people would see it, that was celebrating African Liberation Day. And it's taller than any sculpture you could get for Africa. So I took pieces over there all the time. That's what I was doing. And then when finally I decided I was going to put up a piece of artwork to Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X. Now, I was not a big fan of Malcolm X, but I knew about him. Now, Marcus Garvey, I didn't know nothing about him until I finished college. So when I made this piece of artwork, I made it out of weatherman steel, a large piece out of weatherman steel, and I had to let it settle for 6 months before it would weather so it would look right. I bought an apartment building on Belmont Street in '86. So if you're gonna do public art, you gotta have a place to put it. So I decided, I own the apartment building down the street, I'll put it in front of my apartment building. I ain't gonna ask nobody.
Calling on Malcolm to convert all the X-wearing people in this area. All right. With your pop being right up the street, we know that you are close enough to know our situation. Let the fire of your spirit cleanse this street and make it a place where conscious people can live and love without stray bullets jumping through their windows and drug dealers swarming all over their cars. Let your voice sound every day in the minds of those who do nothing all day but contribute to our people's misery and degradation.
We must begin to listen carefully to the words of those who move us away from the path of Malcolm and Garvey, because they are in our churches, our institutions, our schools, in our homes. They're our friends. They're ones that we believe in. And we hear them saying things that have nothing to do with Malcolm and Garvey while still wearing the clothes of Malcolm and Garvey. The X-men, the non-men, the men who come to us hoping to make $1 off of Malcolm and Garvey. Move us away from those men, because they are not bearers of truth. They are not bearers of the word. They are not even people who have read and really digested Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X.
But my friends came around to the dedication. I had maybe 50, 100 people for my dedication of the piece, Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X. And I put it up on Marcus Garvey's birthday, and I put a plaque in bronze. And then finally, the mayor, Marion Berry, put it in the brochures about black things to see in Washington. All the things that done in Washington before that were done by white artists. They didn't allow no blacks to do nothing.
When I met at UZIKEE, it was through a program that was started by the University of the District of Columbia, a cooperative extension service, to seize a piece of vacant property on Belmont Street to utilize it for what they called raised bed gardening. These frames that would hold the amendments that were necessary for plant growth and translate that into productive gardens for the community. And since he had an association with the University of the District of Columbia, he was very much interested in terms of what they were doing on his block.
UZIKEE owns 3 properties on Belmont Street in Northwest. And you gotta realize he hired a lot of us to help him fix his houses, help him fix his rental property. At the University of the District of Columbia, where UZIKEE used to teach, he used to teach HVAC, heating and cooling repair and plumbing and stuff. So he was teaching them guys how to install furnaces and stuff like that.
So I knew about that. When I first moved around here, I ran around with the urban planners and the architects. They got their masters from urban planning up to Howard University. These are people that I was talking to up at Washington Tech. And they were the ones that told me if you don't buy, you can't stay.
Growing up on Belmont Street, it was a lot different than it is now. The whole neighborhood back then was predominantly black and poor when I was younger. And when I was little, only white people you saw were like buying drugs and stuff over here on this street. Across the street was a Pitts Hotel, which before I was born, it was like a hotel for like prominent black entertainers and stuff that used to come into DC to perform. I think it was called like the Pitts Motor Inn or something like that back then. A lot of people stayed there. I know James Brown stayed there. And they stayed at the Pitts Hotel because they couldn't stay anyplace else. They couldn't stay at hotels downtown and stuff like that.
Whatever community my brother was a part of, be it Peoria or D.C., he was always an advocate of teaching and building the community.
I needed some bodies to help haul, to clean the bricks, and doing different things. So I hired the young boys in the neighborhood. 12 and 13-year-old boys, I hired them. They gave them their first summer job or their job, period. They worked for me on Saturday and Sunday because I worked every day.
He hired a lot of us to like help him fix his houses, help him fix his rental properties. All this property around here and stuff, they was giving it away when I was growing up.
Because it was cheap enough for anybody to buy houses in the district in the 1970s and the 80s. And then eventually, a lot of the young kids in the neighborhood, once they became older, they went out and bought buildings themselves and started fixing them up, bought themselves a house.
14th Street is like a major street in DC that basically goes all the way uptown, basically going towards Silver Spring, to going all the way downtown till you get the bridge going down to Virginia. When I was growing up, everybody called DC the Chocolate City. Along that 14th Street corridor, back when I was growing up, it was hood.
14th Street, when I came, was just little black businesses up 14th Street. Now, the white businesses had left at that time during the riots. So the riots in '68, all the white businesses left 14th Street. They left because a lot of them got burned out. They burned out the white businesses. The black people that got rioted in D.C. was mad with the white people for killing King. That's how the black people thought about it. The masses of black people thought about it. The black business in the city, they didn't burn them at all. They put Soul Brothers and everything else on the buildings. I saw pictures of it. Where the black business, the hairdressers, whatever they had, the little stores and everything, they didn't burn them at all. If they burned the black business, it was by mistake. As soon as I retired, I started working on a piece for Cleveland and North. And I think I worked on it for about a year.
What was important with Zeke is that the artwork that he had and the things that he did were never done for his house, for his home, and his friends. He created a space and a decision for the work to have two sets of artwork that were very, very interesting to me. One was artworks for communities that he did for a neighborhood and put into a park.
I saw an article in the city paper. This guy named Sonny Bono, who used to be married to Cher, he got killed. He killed skiing in an accident in California, ran into a tree. And some guy adopted a park. All the parks in the city were federal parks until 1976. In 1976, that's when they had the first district government all over. So they decided all the little small parks that are made by the state streets crossing the regular streets, they will give them to the district.
The way the district is planned, you have a lot of vest parks, triangular, irregular shaped land masses that the district had to maintain in some fashion. and they were a part of community, but in many cases, people just planted grass.
So they had a lot of little parks like that all over, but they had nothing on them. When I saw that, I thought, how do you find out about adopting the park? So I got in contact with the D.C. Parks and Recreation Department. That happened to be the last time Barry was the mayor of the city. And so there's a woman named Diane Quinn was head of it. And I called her up, in fact, I want to adopt some parks. And so after I told her I want to adopt a park, I said, yeah, you can adopt a park on 16th Street.
UZIKEE saw the potential of combining his art as public art in these spaces. And that was innovative, and it was something that the district had not really focused on.
So I adopted these parks. I went up there and cleaned it out, then put a foundation down. I told them what I was doing, and I had my friends help me. I just didn't do it by myself. I had all these friends from WTI to work with me on the park. Now, you have to have a foundation when you put a big sculpture up. You just can't stick it in the ground. The wind will blow it up and hurt somebody. So you got to know something about structure, foundation, how deep you're supposed to make it, according to the weather. Now, around D.C., you can go down 4 feet, you're okay. But if you go to Chicago, you may have to go down 6 feet. So once I dealt with the foundation, I was able to put the piece up. You got a piece that's 17 feet tall. Once you make it, you can't take it back, ain't no space for it. So you got to move it out and go where you're going. You got to get everything right. With a crane now, you have to have a crane to put it up. You just can't go in with a little horse to put it up. The day I decided to put the piece up, I had this guy, he had I guess he had his boss truck. The guy was in such a hurry putting up the piece, it was very cold. He dropped the sculpture with the chains around it. He didn't secure it right, and it fell and broke some of the glass. So finally, he had to pick it back up, put it up, then we had a difficult time putting him in, making it move a little, because he wasn't that good an operator. So I had to wedge it just a little to make it work. And we got it in and bolted it down. Then I had to get up on top of the piece and weld the crown on top of it, the Sankofa bird on top.
And tonight, my Good News 9 features the sculptor, Alton UZIKEE Nelson. Alton UZIKEE Nelson speaks lovingly about his mentor, Dr. Cleveland L. Denard, the founding president of the Washington Technical Institute, later named the University of the District of Columbia.
He was one of the first administrators that I know of to have African art in his office, in his home. And that's how I got involved with him.
As a tribute to Denard, UZIKEE adopted this small triangular parkland on 16th Street and dedicated his most recent sculpture called Saint Denard.
What is it that you want your art to say?
I wanted to say to the black people in Washington to be proud of your African roots, because that's one of the most important things I think you should be proud of. And quite a few black Americans are not proud of it because of slavery.
His artwork can be seen throughout his Northwest neighborhood, standing tall, fashioned from weathering steel. But his boldest is St. Denard, 17 feet high, commemorating a noted African-American educator.
I found the most wonderful spot. It is the very best.
By the way, for 23 years, Alton UZIKEE Nelson taught engineering at Washington Technical Institute and later at UDC. until he retired in 1994. And during that time, Dr. Denard became his friend and his mentor.
The revolutionary spirit of UZIKEE Nelson's work is that he went out to establish landmark work on his own, without grants, without other support. He got the permission to use, which is public land, to put up art.
What UZIKEE has done, really, I think, is not just an act of resistance, but an act of extreme creativity.
So UZIKEE's art then represents a pioneering effort to introduce to the wider D.C. area African-centric art into public spaces.
For UZIKEE Nelson to do our heroes in a spiritual manner, because when you look at the sculptures, they're not a physical portrait of the person, where you see a photograph and say, oh, that's Paul Robeson. It's a spiritual portrait. And the energy that emanates from that is much greater than the physical.
When I was in college, there was always stuff about people that might be communists or something. So Paul Robeson, I later found out, was banned by the government. And one of the things that happened with the government, most governors try to make the artists sing their tune. If the artists don't sing their tune, they're out of breath. And then I thought he was doing all these positive things by his artwork, singing and acting. He was doing positive things. He was with the federal government during World War II. But when it came around to the Korean War, he had kind of like switched. So they had banned him for 5 years, singing, producing anything. It took the Supreme Court finally ruled and said, you can't take this man's passport because you don't like his politics, because he could go to Russia, he's been to other places. When I found out more about his life, he had a book out, Here I Stand. I got the copy of the Here I Stand, a book that was kind of banned for a little while, but finally the government had to let it out there. So I read about Paul Robeson, all the things he was doing. He was protesting racism in the government printing office, racism down the Ford Theater, racism everything in D.C. But he could go over to Europe, and they didn't have the same racism over in Europe that they had in D.C. So he would want to go over there and perform. Othello, he did on Broadway. He was doing all these things. He was a big-time movie star. While he was going to law school, he played pro football on the weekend. So he was a Renaissance man. That's what I can tell you. I never heard of no other Renaissance man but him. He could do it all.
I don't know exactly when it was I met UZIKEE. It was a long time ago, though. And decades have passed since then. And somehow or another, maybe it was his, let's say, Southern patois that made me know that he was from down south, and we had something in common being from Mississippi, we discovered. Then one day I was at the inside Industrial Bank, the black-owned bank in D.C., and here's one of his sculptures in the bank, and it's like, wow, I mean, this guy's work really gets around. And one day I was at the Anacostia Museum, and I saw this huge, beautiful sculpture, and this UZIKEE sculpture.
Culture is a living entity. If you don't nurture it, celebrate it, it will slowly dissipate. And so that's what cultural arts activism is helping to keep our ancestors' memories and history alive in some way through the arts.
Thurgood Marshall, people know who he is, but UZIKEE wants to make sure they don't forget who he is.
He, in essence, takes the culture, takes the art, and shows people that it could be done. It is what we must do. It is the instrument. The art is the instrument of conversation, dialogue, and love. It is something that gets in you and converses with you when the artist is not even there.
Finally, after I came back to Peoria, in about 5 years after my father had passed, they called the piece Doc. So I said, that sounds like a good name, named after my father. That's a good name. He always encouraged me to do my artwork. He kind of liked my first piece of artwork I did. I didn't think too much of it, but he thought a lot of it. When I started the piece, I put the neck, I took a pipe and went around the neck and made the neck with it. Although it was a big pipe on the inside, I put a small pipe around it and welded it together. I made it completely out of what we call scrap metal that I could find. So I made the whole thing out of scrap metal, even put something up on the top of it. And I never had no name for it at all. I never even thought about a name. I did put an Ankh on there. I said, well, that's Egyptian Ankh. I'll put that on there.
When I see UZIKEE, I see a distinct, long historical process of a family that understood the significance of the Underground Railroad.
And we actually found all the people that owned the slaves that escaped. This is one man that got caught. He owned by a guy named William Simpson. And they put him in jail, and the police, they put him in jail and put an advertisement in the paper. The advertisement was to tell the people who own their people, we caught them. But you gotta come and pay us for catching them. So that's how the sheriff got a little money, the people that caught them got money. They were kind of like working together. Now if the people didn't show up in a certain while, they just sold them again as slaves. So that's how the system worked.
When I learned of UZIKEE's family's connection with the story of the Underground Railroad, that was phenomenal.
I became interested in history, ancestral history, in 1972, when my mother called me and told me, go get this book and read about your ancestors in this book called The Underground Railroad Record.
William Still was a remarkable character in the Underground Railroad days. Sometime in the 1850s, we don't know exactly when, he began keeping a record of interviews that he would conduct of freedom seekers coming through his home and his business there in Philadelphia and writing down their stories. And in 1872, he took what he had written down and published it into a book called The Underground Railroad. And it involved 190 stories involving over 900 people who came through his Underground Railroad station.
In 1972, after reading this book about the Underground Railroad, my grandfather had a sister still living in New York City. She must have been 80-some-odd years old, in mid-80s. She lived in Queens, New York. My sister was a social worker. She found her, and she started to talk to me and tell me about where they came from. So they came from a little place called Aldie, right next to Middleburg in Loudoun County, in Virginia, right next to Little River Turnpike. Now, we interviewed her when she was 100, and she lived to be 109. And so she started to talk to me about Oak Hill and the Aldie Mill. She always would talk about this creek they called it Goose Creek. They dammed up the water for the mill, and they would dam it up, and when they wanted to use it, they would let it go, and it would dry the power wheel. Peter Michael's a good friend of mine that I've known for about 25 years or more. He came and we got together and we communicated about slavery, and he was telling me about one place his relatives operated one of these safe houses for blacks that were running away from slavery right close to the Potomac River. Peter Michael's forefathers were white abolitionists that ran a safe house for blacks running away slavery from Virginia and Maryland going north on the Underground Railroad. So, and they helped my relatives escape slavery by doing this. Frank Wanzel was delivery man for this general store, and they delivered the mail and everything. But he was a real light-skinned black guy that could pass for white. His father's name was Luther Sullivan. His mother was a slave woman. Her last name was Wanzer.
So Wanzer had had enough, and the trigger to his escape was that he had gotten word that his, quote, owner, I hate that term, was in financial difficulty and was thinking of selling him south for what he could get on the market. And Wanzer wasn't interested in that. So he organized this escape and off he went.
When you think of attempting to escape off of a plantation, the question becomes, do you take your family with you or not? Are they safer here or are they safer with me? Plantation life had to be horrendous.
On Christmas Eve of 1855, Frank Wanzer and his party of 5 others escaped.
He had this wagon from Middleburg that he had acquired, and he also had weapons. Unusual, like most slaves didn't have weapons. He had all these weapons, guns.
He took the necessary steps to both get the armament that he felt that he would need to be able to stand off anybody who got in his way.
Now he learned about how to escape because a lot of people escaped through Loudoun County. The Quakers helped them escape and told them where they could stop to get help on the way.
And they came across the Potomac River at a crossing that was owned by a white man, but it was operated by his slave, a black man who transported fugitives on a regular basis across the Potomac River.
Now you know you couldn't go all in one time, one night or one day, so you had to have some place to stop.
Here at Cooling Springs Farm, which is 3 miles north of the Potomac River, the oral tradition which came down in my family is that my great-great-grandparents and their children assisted freedom seekers on the way north.
So that was a place for him to stop. And his relatives operated this safe house.
If you look at his route from where he escaped in Aldie, Virginia, to where we know he ended up on Christmas Day in Columbia, Pennsylvania, the halfway point is about exactly here. And if you aided a freedom seeker, you also were breaking the law, right from the beginning, right from the Constitution. You were violating the law of the United States and you could be prosecuted or worse. And they suffered plenty for speaking out what they said. They would be chased down, slave catchers would bother them, the law would bother them, but they kept speaking because they felt that they had no moral choice except to speak out.
Eventually, in a little place called Hood's Mill, Maryland, is where they were stopped at. And the slave catchers tried to catch them and take them back. But they pulled out their guns, and the slave catchers didn't want no parts of the guns. And the slave wasn't going to be taken.
And they were pushed to the point where certain decisions had to be made. And they were made. And not everybody made it.
Wanzer had his fiancée, along with another couple, the Grigsby couple, and then 2 single young men who didn't make it all the way. One was killed and one was captured here in Maryland. Sad occasion. Wanzer, however, made it to Columbia, Pennsylvania, where they were aided by William Whipper, a famous Underground Railroad conductor and safe house operator. On New Year's Day, Whipper, in one of his rail cars, he owned 23, sent them on to Philadelphia, where they were aided by William Still, one of the most famous safe house operators and writers of Underground Railroad days. and still, after a few days, sent them by an actual train, an actual railroad, to upstate New York. They went across Lake Erie into Canada, where they lived peacefully for the rest of their lives. The story of the Underground Railroad, it's really the bedrock moral story of our entire country.
This is WPFW Washington. I'm Askia Muhammad. Here are some headlines. President Donald Trump sparked international outrage over a racist comment in which he said the U.S. should limit immigration from Haiti, El Salvador, and African nations in favor of countries with majority white population.
When I came in the district, it was about 80 or 90% black. When they first started to have elections, 80 to 90%. Then after the 90s came along, when the Metro came through, it started to escalate the prices of houses in the neighborhood. That's when it started to be unaffordable for people to buy houses in the district. They tore up the 14th Street, they tore up U Street, and they tunneled up under the buildings and built the Metro. It went right up the street. And then when they say where the Metro sites are, that's where they built big apartment buildings first in Columbia Heights. When I first came around, there was no such thing as Columbia Heights. The real estate people called it Columbia Heights.
When they tore down the pits and they built those condos and stuff, like right across the street from UZIKEE, that's when it just the shit just completely changed.
Many people may consider Columbia Heights a work of art. One person who may agree with me is Jeff Griffiths, who joins us now. You are spearheading a move in an effort to really revitalize the Columbia Heights area. Now, as I've seen in doing these stories, that move is already underway. What can you tell us about the future and the vision for Columbia Heights?
They came together and put together a concept and a master plan for the 14th Street area around the new Metro site.
Right.
And it is encompassing about 11 or so acres. And really what Columbia Heights is now looking for is that to be the economic development for the future. Oftentimes in urban neighborhoods, things happen without really the residential or the people that live here being a part of it. And Columbia Heights felt very strongly that we need to have some sort of impact into what goes there. We live here, it will affect our quality of life, and it'll be very important for us to see what happens there.
Does it almost create a sense of inclusion and ownership and participation?
Absolutely so. And I think it gives us something to look back to and refer to. And when we look to, for instance, the mayor's office for leadership and direction, we can point to this and we can say, look, this is what we put together. We want to work with the city, we want to work with the private developers, we want to really implement this and make it a great place, make it an urban space that we enjoy, but also people around the city and the region will enjoy to come to and shop.
The change in demographics in DC they're interesting. It depends on who you ask. 2 or 3 years ago was the first time I think black people don't have the majority in the city anymore.
What's happening in DC right now is indicative of what's going on all over the country, with white flight going to the suburbs and then people getting tired of traffic and wanting a more urban cultural environment. So all of a sudden they're coming back. But when one community pushes another community out or doesn't realize their value, that's when it becomes a problem. In the Malcolm X Park in DC, you have a drum circle on Sundays. Everybody gets together. But now that you have high-rises and expensive condominiums around there, the people decide that the drum circles are noise. And it's the noise that they don't want on a Sunday because they want to sit around and read the Washington Post or the New York Times. You have to accept the culture that was there before them and not come in and want to change it, like killing all the buffalo and moving the Indians off the land because it's got oil or gold or whatever you want, you know?
The National Park Service, through an act created by the United States Congress, developed a program called the National Underground Railroad Act. And that put into motion an effort on the part of the federal government to begin to collaborate some of the written histories and it could dispel some of the myth that was always a part of history.
I had retired from working up at UDC, so I started to follow the Underground Railroad trail of certain people escaping slavery, like Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass. So I would go to all these places with Benford Ford. I was a driver for the Park Service. So I would drive with them. We would go hundreds of miles. We'd go anywhere from Canada to Memphis. We went around all different places where they had an Underground Railroad site.
You have sacred spaces throughout this country that are meaningful because they represent the lives of the enslaved and their contribution to our history. But they only become important if they're preserved.
Vince had the Park Service to help fix this up, fix it. Because it started falling all down.
Because in a minute's notice, they can be bulldozed out of existence, and future generations will never know what existed in those spaces.
The Masons came over here and fixed it. Fixed the top of it. Do different things to help preserve it.
And that's why there is a crisis within the United States and throughout the world in the preservation of these sacred spaces.
See, they put the caskets up here on top of this. They could store about 5 or 6 caskets. And then wait till the spring to dig. So what they can...
This is like a holding...
holding, right.
Like a refrigerator.
It's kind of like a refrigerator. But the body wouldn't deteriorate because it's cold. The National Park Service would always have these annual meetings about the Underground Railroad, and I would go to them because they'd ask me to speak and tell my story about the Underground Railroad.
You could have the best story in the world, but if you don't have the place that you can point to, then it's hard to designate space as being historic. People want to see a physical building that has historic integrity. And as African American people enslaved, we did not own property to a large degree. And the property that we did have, for the most part, has been bulldozed out of existence. So we were fighting an uphill battle. We had the story.
Yes, I agree with that.
But we didn't have the physical sites that met the criteria of the federal program for historic preservation. UZIKEE showed me the sacred space for the Wanzer family. But we had to go to Canada. And Frank Wanzer's grave in Canada is preserved. So no one can take that away from UZIKEE's family.
I really enjoy the Underground Railroad stories because there were thousands and thousands of stories so that people can go back and have reference to where their relatives escaped from.
One of the things that I've learned about UZIKEE, and it's exemplified in a quotation by a ecologist by the name of Baba Diem. He's Senegalese, and he penned this mantra that I think represents UZIKEE. In the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. I think UZIKEE's life is representative of that. UZIKEE loves history, but UZIKEE loves family. There is no separation between the history and the family. And any opportunity that UZIKEE has to talk about the legacy of his family as it relates to the Underground Railroad, or through his art, of course, begins to express itself in all kinds of communication. And that communication evolved in the direction of history.
I don't know what the Underground Railroad is like. When I see him, I see it. I get to understand what that represented. I would read the word and I would read the story in books, in historical books and other kinds of things. I would use the word in talking, but to say that I understand what that was. When I see UZIKEE, I see that.
If I would attempt to give my ideas on what UZIKEE stands for, on who he advocated for, I would say something similar to what our current president says, who says that he is for the forgotten people.
You know, he triggers some things that we choose to forget or choose to be apathetic about, even the most progressive of us.
Be it right or wrong, if he's upset about the Martin Luther King statue being made by a Chinese sculptor and it should be made by a man of color who he believes can represent their own race or their own people better than someone from across the planet. Now, you could agree with him or disagree with him, but he's gonna fight his fights and keep advocating until he's satisfied that people have heard. They might not agree, but they heard what he had to say. I mean, that's just the way he is.
And he has taken on some of the most insulated institutions, art institutions of Washington, D.C.
He was this brash artist who really spoke out against injustices that were being heaped against black artists, even by blacks in arts administration.
So the white people in the neighborhood don't know what Carter D. Woodson is, and they don't care. They paid a white artist to do it, so that's that. I don't know who they were called, but the only thing they said is Smart Street in the book. That's the group that selected the art, and they left out the people that was head of Carter D. Woodson organization. And then they told the people, you don't have nothing to say what they're gonna put up, because we already decided. They decided they wanted an old man sitting on the park bench, which is not threatening at all, not doing anything. I think he's kind of looking at the book. But they didn't want him standing up telling what Black History Month was about.
So that's the way the art world kind of works. And de facto, as a result of that, there's, I guess what you could say, self-censorship, in that people are maybe afraid to speak out. But the great thing about UZIKEE is that, as I said, he created his own economic model of self-sufficiency. And as a result of that, so he's not really dependent on people buying his art. He's really not dependent on grants, because he makes art because he wants to, and he makes art because he feels that that's part of his mission, that's part of his destiny.
They had a jury that's 80 to 90% white, and it only takes 50% of the jury for an art contest to tell who won, so blacks will always lose in Washington for all practical purposes.
And there's been TV shows, there's been times when the commission might meet or something of that nature. He comes in with a phrase very simple and say, well, y'all gonna let that happen? or y'all don't recognize?
So a lot of times when he steps out, it's not because he's going to benefit directly, but it's because he's really advocating for all artists. He's advocating for his peers. He's advocating for us.
He is an activist, not just with the artwork, but with political, circumstances and cultural circumstances where they apply to black people. He says, okay, you want to be with me? If not, that's okay too, because I'm going to be out there anyway. And I'm going to be calling out the truth in any environment I go into.
Depiction of the black historical figure was in a weak light, for as I was concerned. Like the one at Lincoln Park, a man on his knees begging the man the freedom. They also had Washington. It's in Lincoln Park. The man that had more slaves than anybody as a president. He had more slaves than Jefferson. He never freed none of them.
I mean, it's almost, it makes me think as the city gets whiter, all of these cultural remains are here. It makes me think almost in a small way like what they're doing in some of these Confederate places. Now, if all the Confederate sons of Confederacy were still all over Richmond, Virginia, you probably would not have removed the statue of Robert E. Lee. The black icons that we see now won't have that fate, but it'll still seem odd maybe in 20, 25 years to look at this place and wonder, well, how did all these places get all these black names when there's nothing but white people in them?
UZIKEE is a man of past, present, and future. I really see him as a futurist in some ways because that's kind of what his work reflects. He is, I would say, kind of somewhat egoless in that he's not really a marketer. He doesn't really promote himself. But people still know who he is. People all over the country have asked him to come and exhibit. And I think because of the scale that he works in, sometimes it may make exhibitions a little challenging because he don't have no small pieces for the most part. I mean, he's got huge, huge, huge pieces that make really, really big statements.
And for people to see his example of hard work, of just, putting in the hours, he gives us that picture. And it's a picture that's not only in a painting or a sculpture, it's a picture of his life with the art as an appendage.
He brings to the public an expression of public art that we haven't seen in very many places throughout the whole country. So what you see in his sculpture, you see part of his personality.
His sculpture on 15th Street Northwest that was dedicated to the Aboriginal people of the world, at his piece that was dedicated to Denard, people put up banners that said resist. And for him, I think it was such a powerful statement in that people acknowledged, they understood the energy and the meaning of his work. Because his work is a statement of resistance. So his life has really been a statement of resistance because he is such an original person. He's such a Renaissance man.
We run into a lot of his old students when we're in Home Depot and stuff getting supplies to fix my place that he's been helping me work on. And a lot of these guys now are always like thanking him and just talking about how they were able to start their own businesses because of what they learned in his class. And then you look, who knows where these guys might have been growing up, being adults back then in like the early 90s in DC, and now these guys are talking about owning their own HVAC companies and stuff because of what they learned in Professor Nelson's class and stuff like that. I mean, you gotta figure he definitely saved a lot of people's lives from like going down the wrong path and stuff in this city. It's why so many people remember him and so many people love him still.
Well, I think that he leaves with Black people a sense that you can do and that you're important, that the people that he put memorials to were important to people in our lives, and he makes sure that you remember. And I think that he will being remembered for that. So he is a very important person.